Imagine a single empire so powerful it controlled the most valuable trade routes in human history, connecting Rome to China, controlling all goods passing between East and West. It was the Kushans, and in 5 AD, they were about to reshape the world. For the next few minutes, you'll discover how nomadic people became masters of an ancient superpower network, how they connected civilizations that had never directly traded before, and why their influence still matters today. By 5 AD, they controlled a stretch of land spanning from the edges of India to the borders of China, and this is where our story truly begins. The Kushans didn't conquer through sheer military dominance alone. They were master strategists who understood something most empires missed. Money flows where roads are safe. In the mountains of Central Asia, specifically in a region called Bactria, the Kushans were establishing control that would fundamentally alter world commerce for centuries. They inherited this region from the collapse of the Greek Seleucid Empire, which had fragmented into dozens of competing kingdoms after Alexander the Great's death. While other powers fought each other, the Kushans saw opportunity. This is the moment when a nomadic confederation transformed into an organized empire. By 5 AD, this transformation was complete, and the consequences were about to ripple across 3 continents. The Silk Road wasn't yet called the Silk Road. That name wouldn't come until centuries later, but the Kushans were laying down the actual pathways that would earn it that name. They were building something greater than just political power. They were engineering the infrastructure of global trade. This wasn't about conquest for conquest's sake. It was about creating a system where merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and ideas could flow freely in exchange for taxes, tolls, and the political prestige of being the empire that made it all possible. To understand why the Kushans controlled such massive influence, you need to understand their geography. Bactria, the heartland of their expanding empire, was located in what we now call Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Imagine standing in a valley surrounded by some of the world's highest mountain ranges. The Hindu Kush to the south, the Pamir Mountains to the east, and numerous other peaks that made travel extremely difficult. Most empires would see this as a limitation. The Kushans saw it as an asset. These mountains created natural choke points. Any trade moving between India and Central Asia, between Central Asia and China, or between the Mediterranean and Asia, had to pass through or around Kushan territory. There was no alternative route that didn't add weeks or months to the journey. By 5 AD, the Kushans had positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of continental commerce. They didn't invent the trade routes. Caravans had been moving goods along these paths for centuries, but they stabilized them. Before the Kushans, traveling merchants faced constant danger. Bandits roamed the mountains. Local tribes demanded random taxes. There was no protection, no infrastructure, no guarantee that you'd arrive at your destination. The Kushans changed this calculation entirely. They established permanent military garrisons along major routes. They built rest stations and markets. They standardized taxation so merchants knew exactly what they'd pay. Most importantly, they provided security. If you traveled under Kushan protection, you would arrive safely. This sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. Security allowed trade to expand exponentially. Small caravans became large ones. Luxury goods that had been rare luxuries became regular commodities. This transformation happened gradually, but accelerated in the first few decades of the 1st century AD, with 5 AD representing a crucial turning point when Kushan power had solidified enough to make these guarantees reliable. The Kushans hadn't always been an organized empire. Originally, they were part of a larger nomadic confederation called the Yuezhi, who lived in Central Asia around the modern-day China-Mongolia border. Around 165 BC, pressure from other nomadic groups pushed the Yuezhi westward in a massive migration that took generations. Different branches of the Yuezhi spread in different directions. Some went south into Afghanistan and became what we call the Kushans. This journey of conquest and settlement took roughly 150 years. By 05D, this process was entering its mature phase. The Kushans had ceased being nomads. They had established permanent capitals, the most famous being Bactria, modern Balkh, and later Peshawar in what's now Pakistan. They adopted the languages and cultural practices of the settled peoples they ruled over. They minted coins and adopted religious traditions from their conquered territories. This wasn't forced, it was pragmatic. A nomadic empire can conquer cities, but it cannot govern them using nomadic systems. You need administrators, written laws, established courts, and permanent institutions. The Kushans built all of this. By 5 AD, under rulers like Soter-Megas and his successors, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a tribal confederation had become a sophisticated state apparatus. The Kushans maintained their reputation as fierce warriors. They could deploy cavalry forces that could devastate enemies in open combat, but they increasingly relied on bureaucracy and commerce rather than constant warfare. This shift from militarism to trade management is crucial to understanding their success. They conquered territory, yes, but they made money through commerce. A merchant paying a tax was far more profitable than a conquered city producing nothing but resistance. This economic insight shaped how they governed and why they invested so heavily in making trade safe and profitable for the merchants who moved goods through their territory. Before the Kushans created their trade empire, the global economy was fragmented into isolated regional markets. India had its trade networks. The Mediterranean had its own. China had its own. But there were few connections between them. A silk robe made in China might take years to reach Rome, passing through dozens of middlemen, each taking a cut. By the time it arrived, the price had increased so dramatically that only the wealthiest could afford it. The Kushans fundamentally changed this dynamic. By 5 AD, they were actively promoting long-distance trade through their territory. They didn't just allow merchants to pass, they incentivized it. They offered reduced taxes to merchants willing to travel longer routes. They provided credit systems so merchants didn't need to carry all their wealth in gold or silver. They created security arrangements so that valuable goods wouldn't be stolen. They even established standardized weights and measures so that disputes about quantities could be resolved fairly. This might sound obvious to modern people accustomed to organized commerce, but it was genuinely innovative for the ancient world. These policies had dramatic effects. The volume of goods moving through Kushan territory exploded. We know this from archaeological evidence. Pottery from different regions starts appearing in places it was never found before. Chinese coins show up in Indian markets. Indian textiles reach Mediterranean ports. Spices from the Spice Islands make their way to Roman kitchens. None of this happened by accident. It was the direct result of Kushan policies. By 5 AD, the empire was generating enormous wealth from taxes on this trade. This wealth allowed them to maintain their military forces, invest in infrastructure, support artists and scholars, and continue expanding their control over additional trade routes. The Kushans discovered something that modern economists understand well. When you reduce transaction costs and increase security, trade volumes increase exponentially, and everyone, including the government, becomes wealthier. This wasn't charity. It was brilliant economic strategy. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Kushan Empire was how it blended cultures. The Kushans themselves brought nomadic traditions from Central Asia. They ruled over Greek-influenced populations in Bactria and former Seleucid territories. They controlled regions where Buddhism was growing rapidly. They governed Hindu populations in India. They maintained diplomatic relations with Roman emperors and Chinese dynasties. Instead of forcing everyone to adopt a single culture, the Kushans did something far smarter. They created space for multiple cultures to coexist and influence each other. By 5 AD, Kushan coins bore inscriptions in Greek, Aramaic, and Sanskrit. Their rulers adopted Hindu and Buddhist titles alongside traditional Central Asian ones. Kings with nomadic names took on Greek titles. They commissioned art that blended Greek sculptural traditions with Buddhist spiritual themes. This wasn't because the Kushans were unusually tolerant, though they weren't persecuting religions, but because economic logic demanded it. To maintain authority over diverse populations, you can't alienate any group. By giving Greek merchants Greek language coins, by supporting Buddhist monasteries, by respecting Hindu traditions, the Kushans ensured loyalty from all their subjects. This cultural synthesis had another important effect. It made cross-cultural trade easier. When a Greek merchant met a Kushan official who could speak Greek and understood Greek customs, transactions went more smoothly. When Indian merchants saw that Kushan rulers respected Hindu traditions, they felt secure doing business. This cultural flexibility became one of the Kushans' greatest assets. They didn't see cultural diversity as a threat to manage, but as an opportunity to leverage. By 5 AD, this approach had become ingrained in Kushan governance. Future rulers would take this even further, but the foundation was already set. The Kushan Empire was becoming a cosmopolitan space where East and West could meet, not as enemies, but as trading partners. Before 5 AD, the great civilizations of the ancient world existed in isolation. Rome knew of China's existence, but contact was rare and dangerous. Indian merchants rarely ventured all the way to Mediterranean ports. Chinese traders didn't regularly visit Indian markets. The Kushans changed this entirely. By controlling Bactria and the major trade routes, they became the essential middlemen connecting these civilizations. The Roman Empire, based in the Mediterranean, was expanding and growing wealthier. This created enormous demand for luxury goods, silks, spices, precious stones, and exotic products that could only be obtained from Asia. The Kushan Empire provided the secure corridor for these goods to travel. Trade goods would enter Kushan territory from the east, undergo taxation and regulation, then be passed westward to Iranian merchants who would eventually deliver them to Roman ports. The reverse flow brought Roman goods eastward. From Roman coins found at Chinese sites, we know that this trade did occur. The Kushans took their percentage at every stage. By 5 AD, the mechanisms for this intercontinental trade were becoming standardized. Merchants developed regular routes. They established relationships with Kushan officials. They built trading posts within Kushan territory. This predictability was revolutionary. A merchant could plan a trading expedition knowing roughly what to expect. This stability attracted more merchants, which attracted more goods, which created more wealth, which allowed the Kushans to invest in better infrastructure, which attracted even more merchants. It's a virtuous cycle that was just beginning to accelerate by 5 AD. The consequences extended far beyond commerce. Ideas traveled along the same routes as goods. Buddhism, which was experiencing rapid growth, began spreading northward into Central Asia and eastward toward China. Greek philosophical ideas reached Indian scholars. Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge reached Islamic scholars centuries later, and eventually Europe. The Kushan-controlled trade routes became highways for the transmission of knowledge and culture. By 5 AD, the Kushan Empire was at the beginning of what would become 4 centuries of dominance. But even at this early stage, their impact was profound and would be permanent. The trade routes they controlled would eventually be called the Silk Road, one of the most important networks in human history. Even after the Kushan Empire fell, these routes continued to function. The infrastructure they built, the systems they developed, the security they provided, all of this outlasted their political power. We can see the consequences of Kushan expansion in unexpected places. The presence of Greek artistic styles and Buddhist sculpture across Asia traces back to Kushan cultural synthesis. The rapid spread of Buddhism from India into China and beyond was accelerated by the security Kushans provided to Buddhist missionaries and monks traveling the routes. the technological transfer that eventually brought papermaking and printing from China to the Islamic world, and eventually Europe, happened because these trade routes existed and functioned. Even Roman emperors eventually sent ambassadors to China, and these missions only became possible because the Kushans maintained the corridors these ambassadors traveled through. The economic impact was equally significant. By creating and controlling these trade routes, the Kushans demonstrated a fundamental economic truth: infrastructure investment pays dividends. By the 5th and 6th centuries AD, long-distance trade was a normal part of the economic landscape. Merchants expected to travel across continents. Goods from Asia regularly appeared in Mediterranean markets. This transformation began with the Kushans. Their expansion in 5 AD wasn't just a political event. It was the opening chapter of a new era. The ancient world had been a collection of isolated civilizations. The Kushan Empire transformed it into an interconnected system. By 5 AD, that transformation was well underway. The world would never be the same. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and fall, but the fundamental insight the Kushans demonstrated, that you could grow wealthy by facilitating trade rather than just conquering territory, would shape human civilization for millennia.